When you sit down to play a high-stakes strategy game, whether it's chess or some intense geopolitical simulation, there's this foundational assumption you make before anyone even makes a move.
Right, you assume you're both playing the same game.
Exactly. You assume both you and your opponent are, reading from the exact same rule book. You assume that both players ultimately want to survive. And because of that, you both calculate risk and reward in roughly the same way.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Like if you capture a key piece, they retreat. Or if you apply, overwhelming pressure, they negotiate to cut their losses.
Well, I mean, that is the bedrock of modern deterrence. You are fundamentally relying on the predictability of your opponent's self-preservation instinct. Like, if they want to survive, you can influence their behavior.
Right. But imagine you're halfway through this incredibly tense game, and your opponent looks you dead in the eye, and they strike a match and set their own side of the board completely on fire.
Oh, wow.
And they look at you and say, I don't care about the points anymore. I only care about making sure you burn with me.
Yeah, that changes things.
In that exact moment, every brilliant strategy you had, every calculated threat you prepared, well, they're instantly useless. The rule book is just gone.
And that terrifying realization, the moment the rules just evaporate, that is precisely where we find ourselves on the global stage right now.
So welcome to today's deep dive.
Yeah.
We are navigating a really dense, highly consequential, and honestly chilling socioeconomic and geopolitical analysis from the Global Review.
Yeah, this one is heavy.
It really is.
Yeah.
The report was authored by Fareed Novin, dated April 6, 2026. Novin describes this whole situation as a second-order Bayesian update on the escalating Israel-Iran war and the direct, heavy involvement of the United States.
And it's wild because over the span of just 6 weeks, what began as this targeted military campaign has completely mutated.
Right. We're no longer looking at regional posturing or proxy skirmishes. We are looking at the mechanics of a global economic and civilizational crisis.
Which is, the underlying premise of Novin's analysis is that the international community is still treating this conflict like a standard negotiation game.
Like they're still trying to find leverage points and diplomatic off-ramps.
Exactly. But the reality is we have crossed a mathematical commitment threshold. We're in an irreversible attrition war now, and the baseline we were using to analyze the Middle East just a month ago, you basically have to throw it out entirely.
Yeah. And real quick, as we dive into the mechanics of how this happened, I want to remind you, the listener, that our goal today isn't to take a side.
Right. Absolutely not.
We aren't endorsing any of the political figures or military strategies involved here, whether that's from the U.S., Israel, or Iran. We are strictly unpacking the factual content and the strategic analysis in this report exactly as it's presented.
We just want to help you see the math and the logic driving these global events right now.
Exactly. Because standard geopolitical commentary often misses the underlying structural shifts happening here. They focus on the explosions, not the changing formulas behind them.
Right, the media gets caught up in the day-to-day strikes.
So let's look at the formula. To understand why the rulebook burned, Novin's analysis points to a massive leadership change that entirely altered Iran's cost-benefit analysis. He zeroes in on a very specific, pivotal date, February 28, 2026.
Yeah, that date changes everything.
On that day, a strike killed Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei, his wife, and several members of his family.
And that event, that is the defining variable in this new equation. Novin refers to it as the martyrdom variable.
The fallout was immediate, right? Because by March 8, under these extreme wartime conditions, his son, Mojtaba Khamenei, was appointed as the third supreme leader.
Right, and this was not a standard political succession at all.
No, not at all. A red Shia flag of revenge was raised at the Jamkuran Mosque in Qom. And the report stresses that this wasn't just like a dramatic piece of state propaganda.
No, it signaled a binding intergenerational commitment to retaliation.
Yeah. Mojtaba Khamenei explicitly stated that every member of the nation who is martyred by the enemy becomes an independent case for revenge.
And this is where that term you mentioned earlier, a Bayesian update, really comes into play.
Let's unpack that a bit. What does that actually mean in this context?
So in statistics, a Bayesian update is what happens when you have to completely adjust your probability of an outcome because brand new, undeniable information has entered the system.
Okay.
Prior to February 28, the analytical assumption was that Iran was playing a utility maximizing game.
Right. They do things to gain leverage.
Exactly. The logic was They disrupt shipping in the Strait of Hormuz, they apply economic pressure through proxies, and they do all of this to gain leverage for a favorable negotiation. They wanted a face-saving settlement to relieve sanctions.
Okay, let's go back to the poker analogy. Traditional deterrence is a game of poker.
Yeah.
You can price someone out of a hand by raising the stakes so high that it makes no financial sense for them to stay in.
Right.
But with this update, it's like Iran is no longer playing poker. They are playing a game of chicken where they've publicly ripped out their own steering wheel.
That captures the structural reality perfectly. What's fascinating here is that within the framework of Shia political theology, the assassination of Ali Khamenei during Ramadan transforms him into a figure whose sacrifice demands historical vindication.
So it's not just a casualty of war anymore.
No, martyrdom isn't an unfortunate byproduct. It becomes a consecration of the cause itself. So when we update our Bayesian model, the mathematical reality is that the reputational and theological cost of backing down now far exceeds any conceivable material benefit of peace.
So they aren't just being crazy.
Exactly. Iran is not acting irrationally. They are simply operating under a completely different theological rationality. If Mojtaba backs down now, he desecrates the very sacrifice that provides him with his legitimacy.
Wow. But wait, if their entire strategy is now based on enduring pain rather than avoiding it, how does the U.S. even negotiate with them? Like, you can't threaten someone who considers martyrdom a victory condition.
You really can't. And that brings us to the massive miscalculation detailed in the report, the ultimatum cascade.
Right, because the traditional U.S. strategy of issuing these coercive ticking clock deadlines is just completely misfiring.
Yeah, we are witnessing a textbook failure of coercive pressure, which happens when the payoff structures of the two sides no longer align.
Let's look at the timeline Novin lays out here because it's pretty revealing. President Trump issued an ultimatum on March 21st.
Right.
Then he extended it to April 6th. Then he threatened that April 7th would be Power Plant Day and Bridge Day. He set a highly specific 8 p.m. Eastern Time deadline for the Strait of Hormuz to be reopened.
And he warned that mass infrastructure destruction would commence if they didn't comply.
Exactly. Concurrently, you had Pakistan, Egypt, and Turkey trying desperately to mediate a 45-day ceasefire, and Iran just flatly rejected it.
They aren't asking for a pause at all.
No. They are demanding a permanent end to the war, totally lifted sanctions, and full compensation for damages. But I'm struggling to understand the U.S. strategy here. Well, if the administration knows Mojtaba Khamenei literally cannot back down without losing his newly inherited power, why issue a Bridge Day ultimatum at all? Isn't it an ultimatum supposed to force a decision? If the U.S. is threatening total infrastructure destruction, why wouldn't Iran at least take the 45-day pause to regroup?
Right, so that is the core of what game theorists call a cheap talk equilibrium.
Cheap talk equilibrium.
Yeah. In signaling theory, the power of a threat relies 100% on its credibility. Think of it as the boy who cried wolf, but with, Tomahawk missiles.
Oh, man.
The U.S. issued a firm deadline, then they deferred it, then they issued another one. Every single time a deadline passes without the ultimate consequence being unleashed, the credibility of the next threat drops to near zero.
So the receiver of the threat, Iran, basically stops listening to the rhetoric and starts looking purely at the historical behavior.
Exactly. They see the hesitation and assume the U.S. doesn't actually want to pull the trigger on a full infrastructure wipeout.
Because the domestic and international cost of actually destroying all civilian power plants in a country of 83 million people is just massive.
It's immense. The U.S. is trapped in a structural deadlock of its own making. Executing that threat is an extraordinary escalation that could collapse whatever remains of global alliances.
But on the flip side, for Iran, capitulating to reopen the Strait of Hormuz under the threat of American bombs is politically impossible.
Right. Both sides are completely structurally locked out of a near-term agreement because the political survival of both leaderships depends on proving they didn't blink.
Okay, so since diplomacy is structurally blocked and these ultimatums are failing, we're seeing the conflict mutate on the ground. The U.S. and Israel have shifted away from targeted military strikes and moved toward a full deindustrialization strategy.
Which is a profound escalation.
And this shift is dragging previously neutral neighboring countries directly into the crossfire. Here's where it gets really interesting. They aren't just taking out military bases anymore. They are burning down the factory that makes the base.
Yes. You're destroying the nation's ability to function tomorrow.
The report highlights the strike on the newly built Tehran-Karaj bridge. It killed 8 people and wounded 95. And this isn't just about blowing up concrete to send a message. That bridge is a massive logistical artery connecting industrial satellites directly to the capital.
Right, you take that out, and you sever the ability to move military hardware and civilian goods simultaneously.
Meanwhile, Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu claimed that 70% of Iran's steel production capacity has been destroyed. But the most structurally devastating event happened on March 18th, when Israel struck the South Pars natural gas field.
Yeah, the South Pars strike is the pivot point for the entire region. It really is.
South Pars supplies 70% of Iran's domestic gas. It feeds their power plants, their heating systems, their daily civilian infrastructure. Taking that out turns the civilian population's basic comfort and survival into a weapon of war.
And the retaliation for that strike was immediate and, notably, asymmetrical.
Right. Iran hit 2 refineries in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, and an Israeli refinery in Haifa. Furthermore, Novin notes that Qatar is absolutely furious about the South Pars strike.
And you have to consider the geology behind why Qatar is reacting this way.
Geology.
Yeah, Qatar's North Field and Iran's South Pars are physically the same underground reservoir.
Wait, really?
Yes. It is essentially one massive subterranean lake of natural gas straddling a maritime border.
Oh, wow. So if you create massive subterranean damage or extreme pressure changes on the Iranian side, you are fundamentally threatening Qatar's primary source of sovereign wealth.
Precisely. And this connects to the bigger picture. The March 24th analytical baseline assumed that the Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, the UAE, would just remain uncomfortable bystanders.
That they would absorb the economic shock of higher shipping costs but stay out of the direct line of fire.
Right. But the South Pars strike completely invalidates that assumption. This is no longer a bilateral conflict. By striking shared, multinational energy infrastructure, those neutral bystanders absorbing economic costs are forced to become active players.
So in the case of South Pars, they accidentally set the neighbor's yard on fire, too.
That's a great way to put it. Qatar goes from a neutral mediator to a panicked state leveraging all of its diplomatic power. You now have a multiplayer energy war. You cannot model de-escalation on a simple two-way ladder when 5 different nations have a hand on the rungs.
Man, as if a multiplayer energy war wasn't destabilizing enough. This doctrine of total infrastructure targeting has breached the most dangerous threshold of all, civilian nuclear facilities.
Yeah, the erasure of red lines around nuclear sites is perhaps the most alarming Bayesian update in Novin's entire report. The implicit taboo that protected these sites for decades has just evaporated.
The Bushehr nuclear power plant was struck 4 times. While there hasn't been a radiation leak yet, the psychological barrier is gone. And this dragged Russia directly into the stakes, because Russia's nuclear agency, Rosatom, had to frantically evacuate 198 of their staff members from Bushehr.
Which is terrifying.
Plus, Iran's stance of nuclear ambiguity is officially over. The IAEA confirmed that Iran has highly enriched uranium securely stored in an undamaged underground facility. And Iran issued a chilling geographical warning. If there is radioactive fallout from these strikes on their facilities, it will end life in the Gulf Cooperation Council capitals, not just in Tehran.
And that geographical threat is highly credible given the wind patterns and Bushehr's location on the coast.
Right.
It is a calculated move by Iran to force the Gulf states to put extreme, desperate, de-escalatory pressure on the U.S. and Israel entirely out of self-preservation. But we also have to examine the military attrition aspect because that changes the calculus in Washington.
Let's look at the toll on the U.S. military. The report details that an Iranian surface-to-air missile shot down a U.S. F-15E. The pilot was killed, and the weapons systems officer had to be rescued in a harrowing 2-day operation involving Delta Force and Navy SEAL team 6 deep inside Iranian territory.
Which is just a massive risk.
They also shot down an A-10 Warthog near the Strait of Hormuz. And on a macro level, the USS Gerald R. Ford aircraft carrier is on track to break the record for the longest deployment since the Vietnam War.
The strain on the forces is incredible.
But if you know the U.S. has overwhelming air superiority, why would the IRGC continuously engage advanced U.S. jets and risk massive retaliation instead of hiding their air defense systems for a decisive moment?
Because this perfectly illustrates the attrition game. They aren't playing a survival game anymore, they are playing an attrition game.
Okay, so it's not about winning individual battles.
Right. Shooting down an F-15 isn't about winning air superiority, it's about forcing a reaction. The IRGC wants to impose continuous domestic political cost on the U.S.
Like vivid recurring casualties.
Exactly. When a U.S. jet goes down, it forces the U.S. military to launch hundreds of elite troops into a highly risky multi-day rescue operation. A downed pilot isn't just a military loss, it's a potential hostage crisis that could paralyze an American presidency.
Because historically, American public tolerance for overseas conflicts plummets when casualties become real and vivid.
Yes, they want the vivid headlines. They want the exhausting rescue missions. The Iranian strategy is to prioritize propaganda and exact a daily psychological toll. They are intentionally choosing attrition over self-preservation.
So what does this all mean for the listener? We're talking about strikes halfway across the world, game theory, military tactics. But how does this hit someone's 401k or their trip to the gas station?
Well, it translates into a structural, sustained global economic shock. There's a direct line between this geopolitical attrition and domestic stagflation.
Novin lays out the probability scenarios in the report, and they have shifted drastically. Scenario B, which is defined as prolonged stagflationary stress, a long energy war, and the structural closure of the Strait of Hormuz, is now listed as the most likely outcome at 52%.
Right.
But the analysts had to introduce a brand new scenario, Scenario B2, full infrastructure war. This sits at a 20% probability and includes the risk of a nuclear incident and massive retaliation against all Gulf energy.
And, I mean, a 20% probability of full infrastructure war is a non-trivial, terrifying metric for global markets to price in.
The macroeconomic impact is already hitting the data. U.S. growth expectations for the coming years are being sharply downgraded to just 0.8% to 1.2%. At the exact same time, there's a looming $200 billion Pentagon supplemental funding request just to sustain this prolonged campaign.
You have a perfect storm for structural stagflation. The global supply chain disruption and systemic energy shock mean high inflation and low growth are likely here to stay.
Because energy prices are baked in at a high premium.
Exactly. Then you combine that slowed economic growth with massive deficit spending to fund the military attrition, like that $200 billion request. That crowds out domestic investment. The economic pain we are seeing isn't a temporary blip that resolves when a treaty is signed. It is a structural feature of this new attrition game.
And while the U.S., Israel, and Iran are locked in this exhausting, devastating war of attrition, someone else is quietly cashing in. Novin's analysis points out that China is reaping massive strategic dividends without firing a single shot.
The multi-layered nature of China's advantage in this scenario is just a masterclass in asymmetrical benefit.
First, there's the intelligence harvest. By watching the U.S. operate against Iran's air defenses, China is gathering empirical intelligence on U.S. fifth-generation stealth aircraft signatures.
Yes, and they're analyzing surface-to-air missile engagement protocols.
Right. And they're studying the specific insertion tactics used by SEAL Team 6 during that pilot rescue. Second, there's the reconstruction monopoly. If Israel's claim is accurate and 70% of Iran's steel capacity is destroyed, their bridges are gone and their energy sector is burning. When the dust finally settles, who rebuilds it?
China.
Exactly. China's perfectly positioned to hold the monopoly on rebuilding Iran's destroyed steel and energy sectors without any political preconditions.
There is a massive difference between theoretical intelligence and empirical intelligence. China is getting to see how top-tier U.S. systems perform in a live, high-threat electronic warfare environment.
And strategically, every single week this attrition war continues, China compounds its geopolitical and economic advantages.
They secure vital data for their own Pacific military planning, they guarantee long-term economic dependency from a rebuilt Iran, and they get to sit back and watch their primary strategic competitor bleed resources and domestic political capital.
Let's take a breath and recap the incredible interconnected journey this report just took us on.
Yeah, it's a lot to wrap your head around.
We started by seeing how a single event, the assassination of a leader, fundamentally shifted an entire nation's strategy from calculated deterrence to theological martyrdom.
Right.
We saw how that mathematical shift caused a total collapse in diplomatic negotiations, rendering traditional ultimatums completely useless. That structural deadlock led to a full-blown deindustrialization campaign, which accidentally regionalized the war by threatening shared multinational energy assets.
Setting the neighbor's yard on fire.
Exactly. And finally, we saw how erased red lines around nuclear facilities and relentless military attrition are dragging the entire global economy into prolonged stagflation, while China quietly collects the long-term strategic winnings.
And if we pull all of these threads together, Novin's report forces us to confront a deeply uncomfortable question.
What's that?
Well, we live in a world of intricately interconnected global supply chains, fragile energy markets, and shared infrastructure. What happens when a conflict arises where the absolute survival of both leaderships relies entirely on them proving they can endure more pain than the other side?
Wow.
When neither side has a steering wheel, how much of the global economy are we willing to let burn just to see who blinks first?
It is a heavy, complex thought to leave you with, but an essential one for understanding the true mechanics of the world right now. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the headlines, keep looking for the underlying formulas driving the events, and remember, the next time someone makes a move on the global board, make sure you know which rule book they're actually reading from.